That title is a bold claim to make, but sometimes you just gotta clickbait people. I read a lot of webtoon series. Most of them are mine / webtoon's fault. You know, I get a notification for an interesting series, maybe an ad pops up, maybe it's release week, whatever it is. I read a lot of series, I know this. However, you guys aren't blameless either. You recommend series to me all the time. Purple Hyacinth, Lalin's Curse, 1HP Club, Cloud Walker, whatever it is, you guys recommend me a lot, and I try to read them. Actually, all of these that I mentioned are currently in my subscription, and honestly, they're pretty fun to read. Now, a lot of the series that I'm subscribed to follow an Isekai premise. If you don't know what that is, maybe you're not in the anime community, an Isekai is when a normal human person gets magically whisked away into a fantasy world. Now, many series have a spin on that kind of style. Standard Isekais have been kind of taken over by the romance genre, which is strange, but you know, whatever. Royalty, princesses, that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, the reverse Isekai has been taken over by the fantasy action series. Series like Omniscient Reader, The World After the Fall, The Advanced Player of the Tutorial Tower, I'm the Max Level Newbie, The Druid of Soul Station, The Lone Necromancer, Return to Player. You know, the very solo leveling like series. However, there's one series that I think weirdly stands out in the isekai space. Just a standard isekai, having one person be magically transplanted into a magical world, but it still stands out above the rest. Something I think solo leveling kind of made a requirement was the overpowered protagonist. A powerful protagonist that we follow and we get to see wreck shop. I go over it better in this video. But there are definitely pros and cons to this kind of trope, and I think we see a lot of those pros and cons based on the characters and where they get their strength from. Now, all of these series are very different, yet sometimes they feel very similar. Not really because of the world or the setting or the power system or the main characters, but sometimes these characters feel very samey. As an example, the Advanced Player of the Tutorial Tower and the Druid of Soul Station are very different series, but often feel a little similar. Not bad, but it doesn't feel like that certified fresh that we all want. So that brings an interesting question. How do you make this stereotype interesting? Well, my favorite reverse isekai, Omniscient Reader, answers that question. That being knowledge. You see, the main character, Doksha Kim, is a somewhat overpowered protagonist, but not really in the way you'd think. Doksha Kim isn't strong, at least not in the traditional sense. He isn't great at combat, he isn't incredibly strong or skilled, he doesn't use insane magic, he doesn't have a lot going for him. Doksha Kim is often presented as more of a weak member of the party, yet he's still considered one of the most dangerous members of our main cast. Mainly because he's smarter than the rest. Yes, he's read the entire story, 3 Ways to Survive the Apocalypse, the story that the world got reverse isekai'd into. Can I use it as a verb? I'm gonna use it as a verb. But Doksha Kim doesn't suddenly become a powerful fighter or magically talented or skilled. We see that he actually isn't. He's not good at fighting. He's not really that talented. Things don't come easily to him. But he still outsmarts and outplays his opponents, based on what he knows and based on what he can assume. But this isn't a talk about my favorite reverse isekai. This is what I think the best isekai is. Let me ask you a question. If you've been transported into a fantasy world, what skill would you think would be the most useful? Well, the Great Estate Developer has an interesting answer to that question. This series is the coolest take on the isekai genre, as we follow technically 2 people, but really one per. Let me explain. We follow Suho Kim, a poverty-stricken, overworked civil engineer student. But randomly one day he was chosen by a random wish granted by the Absolutes, becoming a character from the last book he read, the book Night of Blood and Iron. Interestingly, Suho Kim doesn't become the main hero or the villain, but just a random side character. Well, random might be the wrong term. The story Night of Blood and Iron follows Javier, an incredibly skilled swordsman, following his rise to becoming a master swordsman. He starts off being an unknown knight working under the debt-ridden Lord Arcos Frontera, and watching over the Lord's eldest son, Lloyd Frontera, which is who our main character becomes. Now, what makes this the best isekai webtoon? To most people, this seems like a normal isekai, but where things really get interesting is our main character, Suho and Lloyd. This might be a little confusing. Lloyd is a hooligan, plain and simple, that much is clear. Lloyd is a terrible son and a constant drunk, hated by the community, disliked by his own parents, and despised by our main character, Javier, because of a difficult past. Lloyd is a terrible person, but that's kind of the thing. We follow the person responsible for Lloyd's actions, but we don't really follow Lloyd anymore, which is my first favorite part of this series. A lot of other isekais don't really focus on the character before our character became that character. Wait, hold on, I could say that, I think, a little better. We don't really get to know the character that our main character becomes. However, I think that part of the charm of the series is that Soo-ho Kim needs to almost redeem Lloyd in the eyes of, well, everyone. The original story has the Fronteras have a miserable end. The Baron and the Baroness, Lloyd's parents, lose everything and commit suicide. Meanwhile, Lloyd becomes a beggar and an alcoholic and dies. The opening of the story is Soo-ho just trying to convince others to start trusting Lloyd, which I think is really cool. I like seeing the main character redeem himself, or at least the self he was before, and how he does is really interesting. Now, Lloyd isn't an overpowered protagonist, and neither is Soo-ho Kim. However, like Doksha Kim, I think they follow the same process, because Soo-ho Kim's power comes from his knowledge. I already actually touched on why Soo-ho is so powerful. And when I say powerful, I don't mean strong, physically or magically. I don't even mean the same as Doksha Kim. Soo-ho Kim does know a bit about the future, but that future sight is limited. We see that he hits a certain limit of knowledge quite early on, at least compared to Doksha Kim, who knows the entire story. Meanwhile, we're only 20-ish chapters and he's already reached the limit of what he knows. Instead, what becomes really interesting is who Soo-ho Kim was before. Like I said, he's a poverty-stricken, overworked civil engineer student. But that civil engineering is what makes this the best. Soo-ho Kim knows all about buildings. I clearly don't. But he's skilled enough to make and build one on his own, and is decades ahead of everyone else in terms of architecture, being able to match the magic in the world just based on his civil engineering skills. Heated floor, refrigerated meats, shield tunneling methods, underwater platforms, concrete, water aqueducts, way more that I have no idea. But these are all things that no one in that world knows how to do. But based on Soo-ho Kim's knowledge, based on what he's learned and practiced in his world, not because of random chance, or happenstance, or luck, or the main character syndrome, is he able to be the quote-unquote overpowered protagonist. He's able to change the world, able to change the fate of Lloyd. But that's just part of the reason why I think this series is the best, and the other one has to do with who Soo-ho is, because Soo-ho Kim isn't a great hero. I'm a big fan of morally gray characters. Hardcore Living Warrior and Unordinary are some of my favorite series because of how they handled a main character. Like these characters, Soo-ho isn't heroic. He isn't noble, he isn't pure, he doesn't do things for the greater good. Instead, he's greedy and selfish. He's cunning, which is just bad smart. He's driven by money instead of the greater good or helping others. And these are all things that make a lot of sense. Soo-ho Kim is very used to living paycheck to paycheck, to overworking himself to make sure he has a roof over his head and food on his plate. Soo-ho Kim being transported from a life of debt to another life of debt isn't the hardest transition, but this time he can actually do something about it. And throughout the series, we see that he tries his hardest to overcome his limits, to overcome his situation. Something I always hated is when the main character succeeds because they quote-unquote never give up. But more than that, we don't see them never giving up. They just kind of say they never give up and then win the fights. Meanwhile, this series is a great example of show, don't tell. We see Soo-ho Kim doesn't give up. From him training with Javier with a sword to him spending a literal month, no joke, outside standing in the mud, playing with mud and water, trying to figure out how to reform wetlands. Soo-ho Kim doesn't give up. Which brings us to the last reason why this series is the best, and that's how they handle relationships. Like I said before, Soo-ho inhabits Lloyd. Lloyd has already lived a life before Soo-ho Kim, and a life that has made many people hate him. And when Soo-ho arrives on the scene, he has an uphill battle with most of the town folks and even his parents. But the one I wanted to look at was Javier, the genius swordsman who's the main character of the book Knights of Blood and Iron. Javier has bad blood with Lloyd. While he's tasked with watching over him, it's more just making sure Lloyd doesn't cause any trouble. He was a drunk, a loudmouth, a hooligan, who never helped anyone. This was the polar opposite of Javier, a quiet, respectful, and thoughtful knight who's willing to help out others. Not to mention, Javier and Lloyd have a past, as Javier was adopted by Lord Acros Frontera, and he wanted to grow up to be a knight and protect the Lord. Meanwhile, Lloyd rather rudely breaks his wooden sword, claiming that he can never be a knight. We know that he held on to this resentment for a while, as we see that when we start the series, he has a -30 relationship rating with Lloyd. But when Lloyd as Suho starts to change, we see their bromance only grow. Suho and Javier are different, very different. They have wildly different personalities. While Suho isn't a drunk loudmouth hooligan, he's still kind of greedy, kind of self-centered, but he's smart and reliable. He never gives up, and these are things Javier respects. And throughout the series, as it progresses, as they work together, as they do tasks together, as Lloyd starts making architectural designs and whatever, I don't really know how to describe it, Javier starts and learns to trust in him, learns to appreciate him, and actually starts to respect Lloyd. And while that only happens in 20-ish chapters, I still think it's incredible. They're building a relationship from resentment, from anger, from hatred. And yet, it still feels so natural. It still feels so believable that these two people that did not get along beforehand, we see them working together. We see them relying on each other. We see them fighting alongside of each other. We see them never giving up on each other. And honestly, I just think that's the coolest. And I just think those are just some of the reasons why this series is the best isekai webtoon on the platform. But that's just what I think. What about you? Do you agree? Do you have a different isekai do you think is the best? Leave it in the comments below. But like always, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you next week. Take care.